So Nintendo is pretty well known for doing a lot of things when it comes to their strategy, which makes a lot of gamers out there very angry, but there is one thing that they've mostly done right, and that is backwards compatibility. And while their latest console, the Switch, was lacking this functionality, if history teaches anything is that Nintendo has mostly done this right, and in today's video I want to go through every console that Nintendo ever released which had backwards compatibility, and the number might shock you, so stick around until the end because we will go through all the list of Nintendo consoles. I do think that they pretty much nailed it as much as they could, so let's go down on memory lane, shall we? Alright, so before Nintendo even had the opportunity of doing backwards compatibility, their first ever proper console were the Game & Watches, which basically had one game per device, so you didn't even have compatibility between different consoles, you had basically the same game on one device and that was it. If you want to buy an extra game, then you'll just have to buy another Game & Watch. So that was the initial story of Nintendo and how this whole thing started, but the first proper gaming device, which at least from my point of view, that's the first true one, that device was called the Game Boy. I will not go through all the history and what the Game Boy represented. Most of you already know about this history. Maybe that will be a video for another day. But the Game Boy was the first ever handheld that had proper games. You can swap up cartridges so you can play multiple games. It sold out amazingly. People were really happy about this device. So this was definitely a big success. And while there were multiple iterations, we even had the Game Boy Pocket or the Game Boy Light, which these were actually mostly released in Japan. But there were a couple of iterations of this device alone. But the cartridges were backwards compatible, so you can play the same game on multiple types of Game Boy consoles. But a couple of years later, it was time to introduce a new gaming device which had multiple functionalities, and one of the big functionalities was to introduce a color screen, and that's how we got the Game Boy Color. In a nutshell, the Game Boy Color was pretty much compatible with the Game Boy because it has more or less the same games. You can pretty much play all the Game Boy games on the Game Boy Color. Actually, there were a couple of games that were Game Boy Color exclusives, but that's because it required the color screen, so you couldn't really play them on the original Game Boy. Actually, there were a few that had something in between. You can still enjoy extra colors when you were playing the games on the Game Boy Color, but that's another topic. The main idea was that every game that was released for the Game Boy, the original DMG one, it was backwards compatible and you can still play them on the Game Boy Color. Technically, these were almost the same, but considering that you still got extra games that were only functioning on the Game Boy Color, I do believe that we can consider this still to be backwards compatible. So it is actually a new iteration of a Nintendo console and it has backward compatibility with the original Game Boy DMG. But after the Game Boy Color, it was time to have a proper upgrade of the Game Boy, and that's how we got the Game Boy Advanced, and things changed almost completely. We had new type of cartridges, a new format, better screen, so this was a truly new iteration of the Game Boy consoles. And continue on with the tradition, the Game Boy Advanced actually was backwards compatible with all the Game Boy and Game Boy Colors games. The slot over here on top was able to read both Game Boys and Game Boy Advance games, so it was pretty much fully backwards compatible. Nintendo didn't want to remove that functionality. You can still enjoy your Game Boy collections on a newer device, and that's why I think with the Game Boy Advance this whole tradition actually proper started, because even with a newer console, you can still enjoy your old games on a newer device. And after the Game Boy Advanced, we had the Advance SP that I have over here, and actually this one was still backwards compatible. You had the Game Boy slot right here on the bottom, and you pretty much could play the same games as you did with the Game Boy Advance. This had, on top of the completely reshaped hardware, you also had the backlit screen over here, so from that point of view it was a pretty good upgrade, even though it's still a Game Boy Advance. The SP had these extra functionalities, but it still kept the backwards compatibility with the original Game Boy cartridges, which I think it was amazing. So with all these negative things that Nintendo is doing, and it was doing also back then, this was actually a really good thing. And back then you couldn't really see other companies doing that, so it was something pretty awesome. And even today they are continuing doing that, but stick around until the end because we'll talk about that one as well. Actually, talking about backwards compatibility, then Nintendo chose to do something differently. After the Game Boy Advance, SP, we had the Game Boy Micro, which was another iteration which didn't sell well because it was a tiny little device and I actually don't even have it in my collection, but I will get my hands on that one soon. The whole idea of that console was to have something even smaller you can take on the go, but it had to sacrifice this core functionality of playing Game Boy cartridges on that device. So for the first time in a long time, Nintendo completely removed that functionality, and the Game Boy Micro was the only console that could play their own proper cartridges, and that is only for the Game Boy Advance. But soon after that, Nintendo released a really big console that still today is one of the top favorites of a lot of people, and that one is the Nintendo DS. I have the original one over here, or the DS Fat, but I also have the DS Lite, and it was pretty much the same console but with an overall reshape of the case and also a better screen, but both had this backwards compatibility and functionality, and on top you can play their original DS games, but on the bottom it kept the original Game Boy Advance slot, and as you can see I have a game over here, so you can pretty much put it inside and then you can still enjoy playing your Game Boy Advance games on the new Nintendo DS. And actually for me that was huge back then because with the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance it was pretty much in line. Of course you got the newer type of cartridges, but somehow they were overall in the same family. So for me it felt natural to have backwards compatibility, but with the Nintendo DS having a completely new design, dual screen and all that, to be honest I didn't even expect to have backwards compatibility, but Nintendo done it again, and with the addition of this cartridge reader you can still enjoy your games. It was lacking the original Game Boy functionality, but at this point I don't think everyone cared about that one anymore. Continue on with the Game Boy Advance cartridges on a Nintendo DS, it was amazing and a game changer for me. The Nintendo DSi, which I have over here, pretty much continue on the functionalities of the original DS, but actually it completely removed the Game Boy Advance functionality, and as you can see here on the bottom we don't have that cartridge slot anymore. So the DSi was again a device that was lacking this functionality, and that's why I still prefer the original DS or the DS Lite when it comes to getting one of these consoles. So in 2024, if you are looking on getting a Nintendo DS, the original ones, I would actually go for the DS Lite because it had the more functionalities, and of course the DSi added a couple of extra when it comes to the software wise, but in 2024, to be honest, I cannot recommend this when it comes to the DS consoles. I would rather go for the DS Lite just because of this functionality. And actually just because of this functionality, I also have a Game Boy Macro over here, which is a DS Lite torn in half because the top screen didn't function anymore, and I am able to use this with Game Boy Advance games with this slot over here. And actually currently this is the way on how I play my Game Boy Advance games. I love this device, it's so tiny, I made it myself. I know it's not the most beautiful one out there, but I'm proud of it, and this is how I play my actual Game Boy Advance games in 2024. After the Nintendo DS, it was time for a new model, and that's why Nintendo introduced the Nintendo 3DS, which had a lot more functionalities, more power. The 3D screen, which I know may not have been the best for some of you, but I still think it's pretty cool. Well, not on the original one, but on the newer models. The 3D actually works pretty well, but I will get to that one in a second. But with the introduction of the Nintendo 3DS, Nintendo somehow managed to keep the backwards compatibility with the original Nintendo DS, and the slot over here on the top actually was able to play both Nintendo 3DS and DS games, so the backwards compatibility still worked really good. Of course, we didn't have the Game Boy Advance slot anymore because that one was already removed with the DSi, but I'm really happy that Nintendo still managed to do this and we can still play the DS games on the Nintendo 3DS. And actually, a fun fact for you, this model over here is a Japanese one, and it is region locked. I cannot play Nintendo 3DS games on it except for the Japanese ones, but the region lock is not available for the DS part. So I can still play European or US games on this Nintendo 3DS, so that's pretty amazing. I can still enjoy all those games on this newer console. And talking about newer consoles, after the Nintendo 3DS, we did get the new Nintendo 3DS that I have over here. I made a bunch of videos about it because I cannot stress enough how much I love this device. I continue on playing it even in 2024 quite often, and mostly it played the same games as the original 3DS, and it also kept the backwards compatibility of the Nintendo DS, so you can still do that. There are a few games that require more power, and because the hardware was improved when it comes to this model, and you cannot play them on the original one, and that's why when it comes to the 3DS games, the only console that I can recommend getting in 2024, it has to be the new Nintendo 3DS. This is actually the XL model because the regular one wasn't released in Europe. Now with the Nintendo Switch, you may or may not consider it to be the next iteration of the 3DS. I for one don't really see it that way, but let's go ahead and also talk about the standard consoles that Nintendo released. While the backwards compatibility didn't really work the same way as they did with the handheld devices, Nintendo still was able to do it a couple of times. And the first time they actually done it, it wasn't done with the NES or SNES, Nintendo 64 or GameCube for that matter, but the Wii was actually the first console that kept the backwards compatibility. While the Wii changed completely the media drive, the disc that was using to play games, the GameCube, if you remember, had the tiny discs, and the Wii was actually able to read those tiny discs. It had adapters for introducing the GameCube controllers in the Wii. So basically the Wii was fully compatible with the GameCube, and if you are planning on playing the GameCube games, the Nintendo Wii, the original model only, it's actually a really good way on how to do that. This way you get one console for two generations. You have the GameCube and the Wii, of course. You can just buy a standard GameCube controller, not necessarily cheap, but you can still find those ones. But I still think it was pretty cool that Nintendo managed to do this with the Wii. Then we had the Wii U, which was again backwards compatible with the Wii console. And somehow I believe that Nintendo was starting this trend of continue on with the backwards compatibility, but this actually stopped after the Wii U. While the Wii U was able to play the Wii games, the new iteration, so the Nintendo Switch, was lacking this functionality. But I do believe that was not intentional. The Nintendo Switch completely changed the physical drives that it was using, so we didn't have the disc anymore. Now we were back with the cartridges, the tiny ones that you know for the Nintendo Switch, and of course you couldn't really use a Wii U disc when it comes to the Nintendo Switch. But that doesn't mean necessarily that Nintendo is avoiding this. I do believe if it were possible, then the Nintendo Switch would still keep the backwards compatibility. I know that Nintendo benefit from it quite a lot because they had a ton of games that were re-released on the Switch, which were originally on the Wii U, and they sold those ones for, I don't know, $60, $70. So Nintendo made quite a lot of money when it comes to that. But in my personal opinion, I do believe that the next console, the Switch 2 or whatever it will be called, will keep the backwards compatibility. I'm not sure if Nintendo is planning on going fully digitally because more and more companies apparently are trying to do this. I really hope that the physical media will not die anytime soon. With closing shops, as you see with the Wii U and the 3DS, Sony tried to do this with the PS Vita and the PS3. So I'm really hoping that this trend will not continue, because at some point all this digital media will go away because the companies can just stop using those services altogether. And I am worried that a lot of games will just be completely forgotten. And you already see that all the older titles from Nintendo, the NES, the SNES, and a couple of others are starting to dying off because Nintendo are not re-releasing them on their newer hardware. And that's a shame because at some point we will start losing a couple of games, and I really don't want to do that. But time will tell. I really hope that physical media will not die, and there are rumors that the Switch 2 will go full digitally. But even if they do that with the actual Switch 2 games, I do believe that they will keep the hardware, the card reader slot for the Nintendo Switch 1, and we will still be able to use our physical collection. But who knows, time will tell. If you ask me, I really think that Nintendo Switch 2 will keep this backwards compatibility. And as you can see, with all these consoles that we went through, Nintendo have been doing this for a while, and while they're not the best, and most of the time gamers are pretty upset with Nintendo, this one thing I think Nintendo really done well, and who knows, maybe they will surprise us once more, and with the Nintendo Switch 2 we'll get this functionality. But what do you guys think? I really want to hear from you guys. Will we get the backwards compatibility with the Switch 2? And what's your opinion about this whole Nintendo history and what they've done with the backwards compatibility? And maybe I've missed some things, and please let me know down in the comments, because who knows, maybe there is a forgotten console out there which I didn't mention. So please let me know down in the comments. Let's have a chat over there. Well, that's it for now. Hope you enjoyed this video. This is the Tech Unravel, and I'll catch you in the next one.